Hello everyone. In this video, I will look at Screwtape letters numbers 16 through 20. Now, in letter 16, C.S. Lewis, or Screwtape, deals with a problem that has grown much greater over the last 70 years, and that's what we would call church hopping. People who can't settle on a church. They go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, always looking for a church that suits them, for a worship style that they like, for preaching that they think is, exceptional. And what happens, Lewis says, is that rather than becoming a parishioner who is there to, learn about God and gather with people, he becomes a critic. A critic, what's got the best worship style, what's got the best preaching. And Lewis says, and he really challenged me on this, that it might be good to go back to the parochial idea of church. What that means is you go to the church that is close to you, and you learn to get along with those people and to grow together in Christ. In that sense, your church is like your family. And even though people divorce their spouse, sadly, almost no one ever divorces their kids, which proves that if you have to get along, you can. So Lewis, or Screwtape, wants Wormwood to tell his patient to go from church to church to church so he can be a critic. This is how he explains the difference. He says, the search for a suitable church makes the man a critic where the enemy wants him to be a pupil. What God, or the enemy, wants of the layman in church is an attitude which may indeed be critical in the sense of rejecting what is false or unhelpful, but which is wholly uncritical in the sense that it does not appraise, does not waste time in thinking about what it rejects, but lays itself open in uncommenting, humble receptivity to any nourishment that is going. You see how groveling, how unspiritual, how irredeemably vulgar he is. This attitude, especially during sermons, creates the condition most hostile to our whole policy, in which platitudes can become really audible to a human soul. Now, it's nice to listen to sermons that are, sophisticated and whatnot. But folks, if we come to church with an open heart, willing to be drawn to God, willing to be convicted, but also lifted up, even the simplest gospel presentation should draw us in. But if we're a critic, we're only there to listen, to get our ears tickled. So, don't be a critic. Go to be a pupil. Go to learn and to be open. In this letter, Lewis has a little fun critiquing two churches. One church has a preacher who has been watering down the faith so much because he thinks that his parishioners can't handle the truth. He's been watering it down so much that he shocks his parishioners rather than vice versa. And in some ways, that may have become even more true today than when Lewis wrote. The other one, which is funny but also sad, is the church that has a reverend named Father Spike. The humans, Screwtape says, are often puzzled to understand the range of his opinions, why he is one day almost a communist, and the next not far from some kind of theocratic fascist. One day a scholastic, the next prepared to deny human reason altogether. One day immersed in politics, and the day after that declaring that all states of this world are equally under judgment. We, of course, see the connecting link, which is hatred. The man cannot bring himself to preach anything which is not calculated to shock, grieve, puzzle, or humiliate his parents and their friends. A sermon which such people could accept would be to him as insipid as a poem with a rhyme scheme and rhyme. That was a little thing. Okay, what Lewis is saying here is that too often preachers even are driven not so much by the truth, but by showing how superior they are to everybody else, whether those people are their parents, their fellow Baptists, the people they had in certain seminary, their Sunday school teacher, whatever. They're driven in a negative way, not to seek truth, but to distance themselves from some form of Christianity that they've been looking down their nose at. So remember this one and stop the church shopping. Let's move on to number 17. This is classic Screwtape because it deals with the sin that is so incredibly minor, it seems like a waste of time. Shouldn't we be focusing on murder and adultery and all the big sins? But again, in Screwtape letters, it is the accumulation of little sins that draws us away from God. Here he deals with gluttony. But he doesn't deal with gluttony of excess, which is what most of us think of, gluttony as overeating. He focuses on what he calls gluttony of delicacy. And it turns out that the patient's mother is a perfect case of gluttony of excess. This is how Screwtape explains it. The mother would be astonished, one day I hope will be, to learn that her whole life has been enslaved to this kind of sensuality, which is quite concealed from her by the fact that the quantities involved are small. But what do quantities matter, provided we can use a human belly and palate to produce querulousness, impatience, uncharitableness, and self-concern? Glubos, that's the tempting devil for the mother, has this old woman well in hand. She is a positive terror to hostesses and servants. She is always turning for what has been offered to her to say with a demure little sigh and smile, oh, please, please, all I want is a cup of tea, weak, but not too weak, and the teeniest, weeniest bit of really crisp toast. You see, because what she wants is smaller and less costly than what has been put before her, she never recognizes as gluttony her determination to get what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. At the very moment of indulging her appetite, she believes she is practicing temperance. In a crowded restaurant, she gives a little scream at the plate which some overworked waitress has set before her and says, oh, that's far too much. Take it away and bring me back about a quarter of it. If challenged, she would say she was doing this to avoid waste. In reality, she does it because the particular shade of delicacy to which we have enslaved her is offended by the sight of more food than she happens to want. You see, it's using food to make us nasty, bitter, resentful, querulous, and making us a trouble for everyone. This woman has convinced herself she is being a good steward by not wasting food. But if she sends the food back, she's only annoying the waitress, annoying the cook, and that food's going to get wasted as well. She thinks she's being frugal or a good steward, but she just is offended by seeing too much food. She wants to have things the way she had when she was young, forgetting that when she was young, she had other enjoyments, not just food, and now food has become an idol to her. And just because it's a small amount of food rather than a large amount of food doesn't change the fact that food as an idol is drawing her away and causing her to drive people crazy and to drive wedges between her friends and her family. Lewis ends the discussion of delicacy by saying, now, if the enemy ever tells that woman that she is maybe too interested in food, then you have to suggest to her that, well, she doesn't mind what she eats herself, but she does like to have things nice for her boy. In fact, of course, her greed has been one of the chief sources of his domestic discomfort for many years. She reminds me of one of those people in church who doesn't like something, but rather than admitting that says, well, it doesn't bother me, but I'm afraid it will offend the senior adults. Stop blaming other people, right? We have to be careful and again recognize as idolatry our desire to have everything exactly the way we want it, no matter how much we drive people crazy. As for the son, being a male, Screwtape says, he's not so prone to the delicacy, the gluttony of delicacy. He's more, and I'll use my own words, get him to play in his pride, to think that he's a connoisseur, that he's James Bond who knows all the best meat and all the best wine and looks down his nose and will only go to a restaurant that serves steaks the proper way. Again, by playing on his male vanity, you also make him into a nuisance, cutting off relationships with his friends who are just tired of his nitpicking idolatry. Again, a very minor sin, but it is the accumulations of little sins that pull us away from God. Let's look at number 13. This one gets really philosophical and theological, and in it, Screwtape tries to describe the difference between the love that the enemy wants and the kind of world that our Father below wants. For God, the enemy, love is the two into one, a joining that makes both parties stronger. What Satan prefers, Screwtape, is what today people would call a zero-sum game, where anything I gain, you lose, and anything I lose, you gain. He wants to make everything kind of basically the Marxist view of the economy, where nobody can be strengthened together, but if one takes, the other loses. Here is the philosophy of hell, according to Screwtape. Letter 18, 16, 17, and now we're on letter 18, sorry. The whole philosophy of hell rests on the recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and especially that one's self is not another self. My good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. A self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. To be means to be in competition. For devils, love makes no sense. Everything is competition. What I have, you lose. Everything is me sucking out of you. Everything is a power game. Everything is about power politics and those who have and those who don't, the oppressor and the victim. Sound familiar today? Now, look at what God means, the enemy means by love. Now, the enemy's philosophy is nothing more nor less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth, that everything is competition. He aims at a contradiction. Things are to be many, yet also somehow one. The good of oneself is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love. And this same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does and even all that he is, or claims to be. Thus, he is not content even himself to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. At the other end of the scale, he introduces into matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate. All right, understand that God is one, but he is also three, the Trinity. For all eternity, the Father has loved the Son, and the Son has loved the Father. And as Lewis explains after Augustine, the love of Father and Son is so real, it is itself a person. The love between Father and Son is the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit is also a person. And the fact that the Father loves the Son and the Son submits to the Father does not take away from their equal worth, right? In love, they are one, and yet they are unique. They're not carbon copy. They're not interchangeable. Father, Son, just like husbands and wives, mothers and fathers are not interchangeable, yet they are equally valuable. This is the secret of love, the two into one flesh. This is the secret of heaven. In heaven, we will be one with God, but we will also be ourselves. Right? So love shows that two people can be separate and distinct and yet be strengthened by their love. Right? When two people in love are both happy, their happiness is doubled. When they're sad, their sadness is cut in half and shared. Now, switching to the image of sex, this is what Screwtape says. The enemy's real motive for fixing on sex as the method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker, as it is indeed among the spiders, where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating her groom. But in the humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desires. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse, for the members are more distinct and yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. Screwtape hates the organism because in the organism, there are all different parts that should be fighting against each other in the zero-sum game ethos of hell, but actually cooperate in a way that strengthens the whole organism. Well, the family is the organism he hates the most. because in the family, the different parts are much more distinct than they are in an organism, but they are also united in a much better way. And so mother, father, son, listen to the song Tradition from the Fiddler on the Roof, how the father and the mother and the son and the daughter all have their different roles and their different focus and their different function in the family, and yet all are of equal value, and together in their love, the two are one, or the four are one, or ever or many are in that family. Now, if we move to letter number 19, we'll understand a little bit better about this understanding of love, because the reasons why the devils can never be reconciled to God is they simply cannot understand love. They know the enemy claims to love the humans, but they also don't believe that, because that's impossible, because there is no such thing as love. There's only competition. Everybody's trying to get something from everybody else. Here's how he explains it. See, Wormwood has accused his uncle of being a heretic in claiming that the enemy loves the humans. And he tries to explain what's going on. Okay, I think this is continuing. I'm sorry. I'm in letter number 19 and explaining why Screwtape said the enemy loves the humans, even though he doesn't really believe that. He's not a heretic, right? He explains why. He says, "The truth is, I slipped by mere carelessness into saying that the enemy really loves the humans. That, of course, is an impossibility. He is one being. They are distinct from him. Their good cannot be his. All his talk about love must be a disguise for something else. He must have some real motive for creating them and taking so much trouble about them. The reason one comes to talk as if he really had this impossible love is our utter failure to find out that real motive. What does he stand to make out of them? That is the insoluble question. I do not see that it can do any harm to tell you that this very problem was the chief cause of our father's quarrel with the enemy. When the creation of man was first debated, and when, even at that stage, the enemy freely confessed that he foresaw a certain episode about a cross, our father very naturally sought an interview and asked for an explanation. The enemy gave no reply except to produce the cock and bull story about disinterested love, which he has been circulating ever since. This our father naturally could not accept. He implored the enemy to lay his cards on the table and gave him every opportunity. He admitted that he felt a real anxiety to know the secret. The enemy replied, "No, I wish with all my heart that you did." It was, I imagine, at this stage in the interview that our father, disgust at such an unprovoked lack of confidence, caused him to remove himself an infinite distance from the presence with a suddenness which has given rise to the ridiculous enemy story that he was forcibly thrown out of heaven. Since then, we have begun to see why our oppressor was so secretive. His throne depends on the secret. Members of his faction have frequently admitted that if ever we, the devils, came to understand what he means by love, the war would be over and we should re-enter heaven. And there lies the great task. We know that he cannot really love them. Nobody can. It doesn't make sense. If we could only find out what he is really up to. Hypothesis after hypothesis has been tried, and still we can't find out. Yet, we must never lose hope. More and more complicated theories, fuller and fuller collections of data, richer rewards for researchers who make progress, more and more terrible punishments for those who fail. All this, pursued and accelerated to the very end of time, cannot surely fail to succeed. You see, if the devils ever really understood love, they might be able to come back to heaven. They might understand God's true love and grace and mercy and accept it. But they refuse to accept it because they cannot understand it. And they cannot understand it because they've chosen disobedience and rebellion. And not only can they not conquer God's love, they can't even understand it because evil is ultimately blind, right? It doesn't understand. It still thinks. The devils cannot conceive how God can love us. He must have an ulterior motive, but they can't figure out what that is. If only they could, then maybe they could overtake heaven. But again, they've chosen, to use a line from the Screwtape letter, from Chronicles of Narnia, they have chosen cunning instead of belief. Their prison is in their own mind, but they are in that prison and so afraid to be taken in that they cannot be taken out. So, love is the secret, but the devils are unable and unwilling to learn what that secret is. Now, in the letters I've talked about, I'm only giving you an overview, he talks a lot about sexuality and how the enemy gave a rule. Either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. And what he's done is used things like the sexual revolution and novels and movies to make people think that the emotion of being in love is the only justifiable ground for marriage. And so while people wait around for that feeling to hit them, they are open to fornication. Or as soon as that love hits them, they may marry the absolute wrong person because they think the only foundation for marriage is a burst of emotions, right? Now, in letter number 20, another one that seems minor, Screwtape shows how the devils want to take men, specifically men now, and get them to be attracted to the kind of women that will not make the kind of wives and helpmeets and partners that they really need to help them and their wife grow in the spiritual life. They want to misdirect the sexual desire to make us seek after the thing that we don't need and that will not make happy Christian marriages that produce children and allow us to raise them, right? And he talks about how at one point they raised up the sort of stuck-up, smug, aristocratic woman who thinks she's above things and is actually someone who ultimately is arrogant and prodigal, right? Get him to go after that kind of person. Then for a while, he made them seek after the sort of weak, foolish woman who is fainting every 5 seconds and couldn't possibly raise children or hold a family together, a sort of child woman forever. But now he says, and it's interesting because what he was writing in the 40s has become true again. Now he says, we are teaching men to like women, to be attracted to women whose bodies are scarcely distinguishable from those of boys. Since this is a kind of beauty even more transitory than most, we thus aggravate the female's chronic horror of growing old, with many excellent results, and render her less willing and less able to bear children. That is not all. We have engineered a great increase in the license which society allows to the representation of the apparent nude, not the real nude, in art and its exhibition on the stage or the bathing beach. It is all a fake, of course. The figures in the popular art are falsely drawn. The real women in bathing suits in tights are actually pinched in and propped up to make them appear firmer and more slender and more boyish than nature allows a full-grown woman to be. Yet at the same time, the modern world is taught to believe that it is being frank and healthy and getting back to nature. As a result, we are more and more directing the desires of men to something which does not exist, making the role of the eye in sexuality more and more important, and at the same time, making its demands more and more impossible. These women that they throw at us in magazines, Victoria's Secret, are not real. They're airbrushed, okay? They're making men seek after an illusion, something that doesn't exist. And even if it existed, to maintain it, a woman would probably not want to have children, right? Thus stopping procreation, because the devil hates children, hates babies, right? And what you're doing is making men attracted to something that in one sense is not real and is also not going to make for a good Christian marriage. Now, he also talks about getting the man to fall in love with what today we might call a vamp, right? He says this kind, right? He says there's two kinds of women. There is the earthly Venus and the hellish Venus, what he calls the terrestrial and infernal Venus. And he actually gets the idea from Plato's Symposium. Now he says the earthly Venus, the good one, is a type for which the man's desire is such as to be naturally amenable to the enemy, readily mixed with charity, readily obedient to marriage, colored all through with that golden light of reverence and naturalness, which we detest. And is another type, which we detest. There is another type, though, that is what he calls the infernal Venus, a type best used to draw him away from marriage altogether. He is a type which the man desires brutally and desires to desire brutally. Even within marriage, he would tend to treat her as a slave, an idol, or an accomplice. His love for the first might involve what the enemy calls evil, but only accidentally. The man would wish that she was not someone else's wife and be sorry that he could not love her lawfully. Right? A man could have a good kind of love for a married woman because that woman draws out a good nature in him and will hopefully direct him towards the right kind of woman, right? But the wrong kind of woman, even if he marries her, is going to corrupt him. This is what she's like. In the second type, the felt evil is what he wants. It is that tang in the flavor which he is after. In the face, it is the visible animality or sulkiness or craft or cruelty which he likes. And in the body, something quite different from what he ordinarily calls beauty. Something he may even in a sane hour describe as ugliness, but which by our art can be made to play on the raw nerve of his private obsession. Again, let him seek after a woman who is not feminine, either because she's really a boy in disguise, a man with breasts, as we say today, or the opposite, she is something like a tiger. If you ever watch on TV those women that show new clothes on the runway, sometimes they make them put an expression on their face that is almost leopard-like they're going to devour you. There's nothing maternal or intimate or loving in this. It's a kind of creature that destroys. And the way men are being told to actually be attracted to women that grab a gun and kill 1,000 people in a movie is really kind of twisted. It's drawing them towards a woman that is not really woman. It's kind of a fantasy, a violent fantasy. And so it will not only keep them away from the right kind of wife, but every so often Screwtape says, you might, on the basis of this false notion of love, convince him to marry one of these women. And he says, such marriages are not only efficient, but delightful. The unhappiness produced is of a very lasting and exquisite kind. So, stop letting movies and Madison Avenue tell you, I'm speaking now specifically to men, what you need in a woman. And also, women, don't let magazines tell you what you need in a husband. Right? Don't be fooled by the propaganda that would turn us away from what we need to something that is unnatural.